Deploying Python on GCE. Hello everybody, this is Ben Finkel, and in this nugget, we're going to take a look at how you can utilize the Google Compute Engine product of the Google Cloud Platform to globally distribute your Python web application with really just a few clicks of the button. When it comes time to deploy your Python application into production, you've got a lot of different options, but one of the most popular and growing in popularity options today is to use a third-party cloud provider in order to host your application. There's a ton of great vendors out there for this: Amazon, Microsoft, Rackspace. Well, in this nugget, we're going to take a look at using Google, and specifically their Google Compute Engine product, in order to host our Python web applications. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to have to breeze through a lot of Google Compute Engine code, but if you're not familiar with Google Compute Engine, go ahead and take a look at our nugget, What is Google Compute Engine? That'll give you a nice brief overview of what this product is. And when you want the in-depth details on the steps that I'm going to go through, you want to watch our nugget series, Google Compute Engine by Garth Schulte. That's going to give you a real in-depth knowledge on what these different commands that I'm going to do are actually accomplishing. For the purposes of this nugget, I'm just going to kind of step through them real quick, explain briefly what they're doing, and then move on to the next. In order to follow along with this nugget, there's a couple of things you want to make sure you've done ahead of time. For starters, you need to create a Google developer account if you don't already have one. That's at console.developers.google.com. You can attach any valid Google account to this. The second thing you need to do is create a project. I've created one here. It's called Studious Saga 711. And you need to enable billing on that project. Now, yes, when you enable billing, you're going to have to put in a credit card number. And that's because Google Compute Engine requires billing enabled in order to spin up any instances. Even the smallest instances have a little tiny bit of charges that accrue with them. However, if you're new to the Developers Console, you can apply for a starter pack credit, which will apply to your account and ensure that you don't get charged any actual charges. While you're doing this, you'll simply dial into that starter pack credit so that you can try this out without having to worry about any financial commitment. Another setup piece that you'll need to do is download the Google Cloud SDK. The instructions for that can be found right here at cloud.google.com/SDK. And this is going to tell you how to get the software development kit installed on your PC, depending on whether you're using Macintosh or Linux or Windows, or even alternative methods if you want to download and install it yourself. It's very easy and quick to do, but you got to make sure that's set up and installed on your system before you can proceed. So you've got your account, you got a project created, you took note of the project ID, which is different than the project name, mind you, and you've got the Google Cloud SDK installed on your command line, you've checked it out and it runs. Let's get started on the first steps. The first step that we need to do is ensure that the desktop we're working on is authenticated to work with the developer account, the Google developer account we created, in order to create instances and connect up to them and so forth. So to do that, we're going to call the gcloud auth login command. And all this is going to do is going to pop up a browser window and walk me through the OAuth process in order to validate that, yes, my Google Cloud SDA that's installed on this desktop can attach to my developer account and do all these things that I need to do. I'm going to go ahead and say accept. It tells me I'm now authenticated, and if I look back at my terminal, I can see that I have default credentials assigned now. So now I am authenticated. I'm allowed to connect to and work in that project from this desktop. The second step, and it tells me to do this right here, is I want to make sure I set my default project that I'm going to work with. This is the project that you created a second ago when you set up your developer account. And you need to do gcloud config set project and then fill in the project ID for your project. That's unique across the globe. Your project ID only belongs to you. No one else has it. So mine is Studious Saga 711. Yours is, of course, going to be different. You need to fill it in there. But once you do that, that ensures that every command we call with gcloud from here on is actually going to use that project by default. So a nice, easy way to clean things up for us. Next, we want to create a static external IP that we can access our website from, that we can plan to access our website from. And in the Google Compute Engine, the Google Cloud Platform, things like external IP addresses are actually a separate, independent, discrete resource that you create and work with, separate from anything else. So the first step is to simply create that by calling gcloud compute addresses create, and we'll call it my new IP. That's just a name for it. Go ahead and enter, and after a moment you'll see it come back and it's going to ask me which region I want that in. This is important. I'm going to make it in US Central 1. And there it is. I've got a new IP in the US-Central 1 region, and I can see the address right there. I'm going to write that down and take a note of that because that's going to be important in a second here. You can validate that your IP address was created simply by jumping up to the Google Developers Console, expanding Compute Engine and then Networks on the left-hand panel. And then you can see on the right-hand side, you've got your networks listed. There's just one, the default network. And of course, my new IP. There's the IP address if you need to look it up, the region that it's in, and the fact that it's not attached to anything yet. We're going to go ahead and get it attached right now to a new instance that we create. And that's very easy to do. Now that we have the IP address that we want, we simply call gcloud compute instances create. Give it a name. Let's call it my instance. And we will give it the address that we want, which is 107.178.214.126. Lastly, I'm going to give it the machine type of F1-micro. This is the smallest, cheapest gcloud instance that we can create. You don't have to put this in. If you leave it off, it'll create a default instance. It's still not very expensive, but I just want to create a nice small one for demonstration purposes. Hit enter, and after a moment, it's going to ask me what zone I want to create this instance in. Now, this is really important. Notice that the region of the IP address that I'm using is US-Central 1. So I've got to use one of these three US-Central 1 zones. Any of those zones that are inside that US-Central 1 region are valid, but if I want to use that IP address, and I do, I've got to pick one of those. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick US-Central 1A and give it a few more moments, and it will create and spin up my instance for me. And once that's finished creating, that only took a few seconds, I can see that I've got my machine type F1 micro with my external IP address that I wanted, and it is in fact running. Now once again, I can go to my Cloud Console and verify that this instance has been created simply by selecting VM Instances on the left-hand side here. And once I've done that, I'm just going to scroll down a little bit here. There again is my instance with all of the same information. So now that I've got my instance built, I'm ready to get the software that I need installed on it. And it's going to come with Python installed because I use the default Debian Linux installation. But what it doesn't have is pip or CherryPy, the framework that I'm using for my server. So I'm going to go ahead and attach to it using the gcloud compute SSH command. My instance is what I named it. And that's going to handle all the background token exchanging authentication stuff that I need it to do. Make sure I choose the right zone. And it's going to log me into this instance with a nice random secure key. Now, once I'm here, I can check that Python is in fact installed, and it is. I've got Python 2.7.3. Perfect. I got to get pip. Well, where can I get pip from here? Actually, I'm already set up for that. I've got down here on my Google Cloud Storage a bucket called My App Server, and I've saved getpip.py up there. So right from my SSH command line, right from my instance, I can simply call gsutil, that's Google Storage Utility, copy, gs colon whack whack my app server / getpip.py space period. That's going to copy getpip.py from that bucket right down into the directory that I'm in. That happens very quickly. I can see it go here. And then all I need to do is sudo python getpip.py. And now it's going to go ahead and install pip on this instance for me. So now I've got pip installed in my instance. I can call sudo pip install CherryPy. And now I'll get the CherryPy web server web framework installed. Now I'm set to go. The last thing I need an application. I need my web application. And you can see that I've also saved that up here in my storage browser bucket, server1.py. Let's take a look at that before I download it. It's a very simple little application. All I'm doing is importing CherryPy. I am setting my socket host to 0.0.0.0 so that any IP address request that comes into the server will be answered by CherryPy. And then I've just got a couple of routes, an index route and a pagex route, so that I can validate that it's working the way that I expect it to. In order to get that on my server, I simply need to call a gsutilcp again, gs:// my app server whack server1.py space dot. That's going to copy this Python file right down into the directory that I'm in. Then a sudo python server1.py, and I can see that CherryPy is now serving, waiting for traffic to come in. How do I test it? Easy, from a browser. Back out here, I'll just go to my IP address, and you can see hello world. I got my response back exactly like I expected. If I browse to the other route, PageX was the other route I had, I can see this is the PageX route. So my Google Compute Engine instance is already serving up my Python application. Now, this very basic demonstration of deploying Python into Google Compute Engine barely scratches the surface of what you can do. You could combine what we just did with startup scripts, and you could create new instances, new Google Compute Engine instances that were hosting your application pretty much on demand. With the click of a button, you could script that out very easily. You could combine that with load balancing to ensure that you had a cross-regional strong uptime for your application. And you can combine all of those things even further with replica pools and auto-scaling to ensure that you had hands-off scalability for your server, all inside of Google Compute Engine, simply by deploying your Python applications to it. That concludes this nugget on deploying Python on GCE. So we saw how you could really easily, with a couple of clicks, set up a virtual machine inside of Google's cloud platform using the Google Compute Engine product to create a computer that would host your Python application. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.